Thanks for joining in. I will present our speakers, and both presenters, both book authors with us today are former colleagues, good friends of the ULB, and it's a great pleasure to have them together today. So going alphabetical order, we have Alvaro Oleart Perez, who completed his PhD with us in the framework of the project Valeur. Ramona Coman, who is with us today as well, was one of the promoters of that project. And after his time at ULB, he went to Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam to work on the Reconnect project, and is now working at Maastricht. Alvaro publishes last year, this year, his excellent book called Framing TTIP in the European Public Spheres. Thank you for being with us, Alvaro.
Yeah,
and our second book author is Julia Rone. Julia was until recently a postdoc fellow in a project that is still ongoing at ULB about conflicts of sovereignty in the European Union. Julia holds a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence and is now a researcher at the University of Cambridge in the CRASH Center. I always have to mention it because I think it's such a cool acronym, in the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, working more specifically on digital issues and digital politics. Thank you very much, Julia, for being with us as well. Julia's book is entitled Contesting Austerity and Free Trade in the EU. So as you can see, it would have been very, very difficult to find two books who speak better to each other. So it's very, very nice to hear about them today. And we have a very distinguished discussant, a good colleague as well, a member of the politicization of trade crew and rising generation, I should say. I think it would be difficult to have more expertise on the politicization of trade concentrated in one seminar. Niels Gheyle is with us today. Niels was a PhD researcher at Ghent University, and he's now working as a postdoc at UCLouvain. Thank you very, very much, Niels, for accepting this invitation to discuss both books and discuss with our authors. So I should probably just let you know before I pass the floor to the speakers that the concept for this double book launch is not that the authors present their own book, but I thought because they know each other's work so well that it would be nice that Julia presents Alvaro's work and book, and the other way around. I think we said we would start with you, Julia, if that's okay. So each of you has the floor for about 10 to 15 minutes maximum. If you go on for longer, I'll let you know. With that, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this. And I will start immediately, I think, with a caveat. And it is that I came to the politicization crew and studies from social movement studies. So for me, it was really, really fascinating to read the work, basically, of all of you. And when I finished Alvaro's book, I thought that our two books, and actually the dissertation of Niels, the PhD dissertation, really complement each other. Not only in terms of theory, but also in terms of empirical cases, because all of us have studied TTIP. I have studied also austerity, but both Alvaro and Niels have focused on very actually different empirical cases, and I will talk a bit more about this now. But now let me share my screen, and I have made a presentation on Alvaro's book. Yes, so do you all see the presentation? Yes, perfect. I will try.
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay, So Alvaro's book is called Framing TTIP in the European Public Spheres, towards an empowering dissensus for EU integration. And basically in this small circle here, I have placed what I think is the main idea of the book from what I understood. And it is that a lot of talk about the politicization of the EU has been very, let's say, concerned about the dangers of politicization and the way it might actually even bring about the dissolution of the union. Alvaro takes a very different perspective that I found very interesting and very stimulating. And what he says basically is that we should not fear contestation, and agonistic contestation actually brings legitimacy to the union and matches policy with politics. And as I present the book, I think all aspects of this central idea of the book will become more clear, hopefully. And I really welcome Alvaro to correct me if I have misunderstood or like misrepresented something. I would be very happy to discuss further. Okay, so I'll just present very quickly first the key contributions of the book, and then two key questions to discuss. Okay, so what I found really fascinating about the book was this attempt to move beyond Euroscepticism by exploring conflict around politics in the Union rather than politics of the Union. That is, Alvaro explores the contestation of TTIP as a proper politicization of a EU policy that brings more participants in the discussion, goes beyond the depoliticized discussions about the EU before, and actually empowers more actors and brings legitimacy to the policies of the Union through politics. And he has this very interesting new term that I really liked, which is empowering dissensus. So he goes beyond the notions of permissive consensus that we had in the early years of the EU that was later replaced by constraining dissensus, according to some theories. And he says what we actually saw in the campaign against TTIP was an empowering dissensus. Now, what does this mean? And why is this so, I think, interesting and novel as an idea? I will show you now a table from his book. I have forgotten the page, but you can double check it once you read the book. But basically what Alvaro shows is that what we have are two options. So we can either have politicization of the EU or limited or no politicization. What we have seen so far, especially when it comes to trade policy, was depoliticized Europeanization. That is, there were executives taking decisions together, most commonly intergovernmental bodies where like the top politicians of each nation took decisions about trade with little involvement of the people, this kind of permissive consensus behind the scenes, very much in the corridors of the EU bubble, as Lisa Parks, I guess, would say, but not in front of the public, not in dialogue with the public. And what Alvaro observes with TTIP is that we move to a different phase in which basically we have politicization, but crucially it's an agonistic Europeanization and like agonistic politicization of the EU, which means that the EU is accepted as a playing field. So we don't question the polity itself at all, we question the policies of this polity. And what this brings, according to Alvaro, is a situation of empowering dissensus, that is politics in the Union. And he very strongly opposes this type of development to what he calls antagonistic Europeanization. And here we basically have a contestation of the EU polity itself. We have actors such as UKIP, actors such as the former Front National, now Rassemblement National, contesting the very existence of the EU as a body that is capable of making crucial decisions about policies that concern all of us. And according to him, this is where we really indeed have this kind of constraining dissensus that the literature has so far spoken about. But it is here in the agonistic Europeanization where the contribution of his book, I think, really becomes clear. Now, how does he basically bring about this idea? How does he develop his contribution? From a theoretical point of view, he basically bridges the theory of public spheres and politicization theory. This is a very crappy collage that I made, but I'm kind of proud with it, because basically what he says is that everyone usually opposes, Habermas and Chantal Mouffe, we have this kind of very, I think, and he basically shows very simplistic representation of what Habermas is saying, which is then contrasted to Mouffe. No, what Alvaro does in his book is he says actually they can be bridged together. We need to bring conflict in the public sphere, and this is actually the best way we can legitimize decisions in the administrative sphere, right? So he bridges these two fields in a very interesting way, and he also brings together Habermas and Mouffe, which I think is really fascinating. But again, and this is crucial when we talk about the EU, he's choosing from Mouffe's theory, especially the emphasis on agonistic conflict. So the conflict that does not question the policy itself, right? The polity itself, sorry, the European Union. When it comes to empirical cases, the book focuses on the UK, France, and Spain, which I found also very, very curious because these were actually not the cases where the TTIP was most politicized. Yet, they are very interesting also because of this, because they allow us to see different modes and, let's say, extents of politicization. And each of these countries has had also a very different relation to the EU. So this allows Alvaro to trace whether the debate on TTIP will be influenced by these very different conceptualizations of the relationship with the EU. Now, something that I found again very, very good in the book was the fact that Alvaro is exploring not only text, but also visuals. And this is something that is only now becoming, I think, more prominent in political science, also social movement studies, from which field I come. And this is actually fascinating because, I mean, the conclusions from the visual analysis were so striking. So he shows very clearly that in terms of figures represented in the first period of basically depoliticized Europeanization of TTIP, when it was executive taking decisions behind closed doors, all the pictures were pictures of executives, and the processual, like the process frames, were frames related to a horse race. So it was all about how quickly we are negotiating and stuff like this. Yet, when we move to the second period that he's observing in his book, which is the period of agonistic politicization, suddenly in the visuals, we see protesters, we see masses of people being very, very angry. So we suddenly see, also purely visually, a lot of different actors appearing in the debate. And what is even more important when it comes to the process aspect of it, we see mass contestation. So it is no longer just like the horse race, but it is actually a true contestation of the agreement. And what I think is most important about Alvaro's approach is the fact that he explores the type of politicization rather than the degree of politicization. Why is this important? In his book, he argues that, of course, the degree of politicization is super important, and there are so many quantitative studies that measure this. But what he wants to see is the type, meaning, are we having here actors that question the EU in general, or are we having instead actors that question policies of the EU while legitimizing the Union itself? And this, I think, again, is quite novel and very interesting. And I also like Chantal Mouffe, so I'm clearly biased. Okay, so what are Alvaro's conclusions? I'm trying to be very brief here. So here I have copied basically a text from his conclusions and have added some things, again, from the book that I have taken as key messages and takeaways. So for Alvaro, the TTIP negotiations can be considered to have contributed to the normalization of the EU as a polity, because so first, TTIP, he finds, was discussed in a very similar way in a number of European countries. And at another point in the book, he calls this a transnational resonance of counter-hegemonic frames in the public spheres. What does he mean by counter-hegemonic? Basically frames that question the very neoliberal approach to trade of the EU. And these types of frames basically were present in each national public sphere he observed, in the UK, in Spain, and in France. So there was a very similar and coherent way of talking about TTIP. Secondly, Alvaro finds that fundamentally different discourses on TTIP have confronted each other in the European public sphere in an agonistic way. So what he means by this is that basically we have this kind of neoliberal discourse of the Commission and some national leaders. Again, this has varied chronologically. But so we have the neoliberal discourse versus the counter-hegemonic outer globalization, or like another world or another Europe in this case is possible type of discourse. And this is really fascinating because neither of the two types of discourses was actually a discourse that negated the EU as a polity. And finally, Alvaro insists that the politicization of TTIP has brought national actors that were often excluded from the EU policymaking into it. And here he gives a lot of examples, and he has wonderful interviews with civil society actors, especially civil society actors at the national level. So he has this metaphor of TTIP bursting the Brussels bubble, which actually, yeah, is interesting to imagine. Okay, so these are the main conclusions of the book. And I want to now just move to two more, I think, fundamental questions that I have after I read it. And so my questions are the following. I actually fully agree with, and I think I'm absolutely fascinated with this distinction between agonistic and antagonistic politicization of the EU, which actually very much also follows in the footsteps of Amandine's work on resistances, right? What I'm not certain about when we talk about the case of TTIP in particular, and I will in a second broaden my question, is could we really consider that the politicization of TTIP was only an example of agonistic politicization and not also an example of antagonistic politicization? I would argue here that we had both. And the reason why Alvaro might have found only agonistic politicization, so the type of, sweet outer globalization discourse that we tend to normatively like most of the cases. So for me, the reason why he found only this type of discourse is very much his focus on quality media, which are progressive media, mainstream media, and economic media. I would argue that had Alvaro focused on, for example, the British tabloids, he would have found a lot of examples of antagonistic politicization. In the same way, there has been a rise of alternative media. I myself have often been branded as a digital media scholar. I do doubt the ultimate importance of digital media, right? I'm not certain whether they're so crucial, but I think that at least the tabloids and maybe, more problematic or at least more right-wing newspapers, not necessarily like tabloids, but just right-wing normal newspapers would have maybe given a different picture. Now, I want to modify my question. I actually think that the antagonistic politicization of TTIP came late, but still it was present. So my question for Alvaro is, how has the choice of quality media influenced your observations? And what happens when we have both types? And this question about both types is not just an empirical question, did we have both types of TTIP? But I think it's also a broader question of what happens if we have both antagonistic and agonistic politicization? Would this ultimately lead to stabilization and legitimation of the EU? Or would it actually make the whole compromise more shaky? So, and thinking about the austerity case, for example, I could very clearly see that different public spheres had very different frames of austerity. TTIP is a great case because there was indeed a lot of harmony in the way different nations and different public spheres discussed the agreement. But with austerity, there were dramatic differences between the way Greece and Germany talked about it. So my question is, what if we actually have both agonistic and antagonistic politicization on a number of issues at the same time? Does this change the conclusions of your book, or do you think that the agonistic politicization would ultimately prevail and actually strengthen the EU? So yeah, these are, I think, my main questions. This was my presentation. I hope you heard me. That was very crucial. I tried to speak very close to the microphone, so I'm sorry if my voice has been shaky, etc. And yeah, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now.
We heard you, Julia. Thank you very much. I think it was a very thought-provoking presentation. I suggest that we go back to you, to the book authors, for a reply to each other's comments and to Niels's comments as well, after Niels has spoken. And I didn't mention this in the beginning of this seminar, but of course, we will open the discussion to all participants after this first round. So bear with us. And again, thank you all for joining. I've noticed that a few more people have joined in the meantime. Okay, great. So let's move on to Julia's book now with the presentation from Alvaro.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks a lot, Julia, for the wonderful presentation. So I don't think I could have done it better. So thanks. Okay, so I'll reply then to the questions after, correct? And I'll first then share my screen.
Yes, exactly. I suggest that after you have some time to reply to each other's comments and to Niels's comments and questions as well.
So yeah, no, thanks so much, Amandine, for organizing this, and to the Institute, and as well for Julia for the great presentation. So I really liked Julia's book, which is entitled "Contesting Austerity and Free Trade in the EU," and I think that there's a lot of overlap between this book and mine. And I think perhaps one thing that we both share is that rather than looking at the European level, we really focus or narrow down our analysis to the national level, where in some ways politics really happens, and how the national context really matters when understanding how and why politicization or social mobilization takes place. And Julia's book departs from an interesting observation, which is this one. So at the same time that we are seeing big protests against austerity in Spain, in Greece, and Portugal, especially in Eastern European countries, but also in Germany, we don't really see much protest. And it happens something similar with ACTA, in which it is heavily politicized in some countries, but really not in others. And in the case of ACTA, for instance, it is interesting that it is, for instance, not politicized in countries where there has been strong anti-austerity mobilization, which we'll come back to it, because there's a direct relation in trying to explain why this is the case. And similar with TTIP. So we see big mobilization against TTIP and against CETA in some countries, but not in others. Now, considering that all these issues have an obvious European dimension that affect directly what the EU is doing, and is being driven to a certain extent by the EU, it remains an interesting question and an interesting puzzle. Why is there such a big difference in the ways in which protests against austerity and free trade are diffused in the EU? And I think this is the central concern of Julia's book, and the great contribution that this book puts forward is precisely in explaining not only how, but also why this is taking place. Now, what I like at the level of theory, and I can go a little bit more after at the more empirical level, but at the level of theory, I like that it departs from, in some ways, a bottom-up critique to the mainstream social movements literature. So in comparison to my book, which departs, for instance, from the political communication angle and the European public sphere, Julia's angle directly goes from social movement studies. And in some ways, I think there is an attempt to go beyond some structural analysis that focus on the concept of political opportunity structure, and rather try to take a more bottom-up approach and say, well, let's see why and how this actually happens by looking at the actors. So it's in some ways an actor-centric approach to social movements, and I really like that, because in some ways that's how social movements are built, with with friendships, with networks that are established at some point and that continue to take place over time. And this network of actors, or this constellation of actors, as Julia puts it in the book, they are of different sort, right? So we can take into account bottom-up protesters, which obviously are relevant, but also media, the interplay between the different type of media, which is also a very interesting point, NGOs, trade unions, political parties, also intellectuals. All of these actors play a role. It's not one or the other actor that plays an important role in explaining how protest is diffused, but also basically what constellation of these type of actors enables that mobilization to be successful. So I think really this is the biggest contribution to the book, in basically saying, well, you know, protest diffusion is not a black box. We can trace how these protests take place, how they are organized, how they happen, and why they are successful. And we don't necessarily need to look at, I don't know, the economic conditions under which certain countries are, but we should actually be looking at those actors that are organizing those protests. And in addition to this, I think but by looking at the actors, it allows for a much more nuanced perspective on explaining precisely why certain mobilizations are successful in some countries and not in others, which is particularly relevant when studying social movements in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. And this is another very important contribution to the book, because it's true that social movement studies are overwhelmingly focused on Western Europe, and that includes my own book, so that's part of it. And I think that this is really an added value that adds to the literature, because as the national context in which a social mobilization takes place matters a lot. Indeed, the history and the tradition of Eastern European countries is very different from Western European countries. So understanding under what conditions Eastern European countries are able to mobilize and in some ways build bridges with Western European activists and protesters is a very relevant point that I think Julia not only explains in an interesting way at the conceptual level, but even at the level of framing the book as a toolbox for some activists to say, well, you know, actually there are some joint projects in which Eastern European activists could work further with Western European activists and trade unions. So I think this is really an important point that she makes. There's also an important point about the role of the media that is taken both as a space and as an actor. And I think I take a similar perspective by emphasizing the important role that journalists play, because what happens in the media and the fact that protesters are able to get their frames, get their ideas in the media is a crucial point for activists. But also the media is an actor in itself, and that's why the creation of alternative media that in some ways touches upon those issues that the mainstream media does not touch, and that in some ways the alternative media or the resonance of some alternative media spaces forces or puts a little bit of pressure on mainstream media to adopt some of the ideas is also an important and relevant factor when trying to understand how this mobilization is successful and when that happens. And all these interesting analysis that Julia puts forward, I think it's nicely done through a triangulation of qualitative methods. And I think it's smart to use different qualitative methods to approach this, because this would be indeed very complicated to do in a quantitative way. And also it would be probably really difficult to find some relevant indicators at the quantitative level to explain the nuances that explain why anti-austerity protests are successful in some countries but not in others. So I think really that is a very relevant point that is to a certain extent also connected to my own book. So I really like the book. I think it is a very important contribution to the social movement literature for these different aspects that I presented. And the case studies are also very well chosen because it allows for a time for a timing analysis to take time into account, because there is also an explanation of the success of social movements on the basis of protest cycles. And in some ways, the fact that anti-austerity protests are taken, which took place mainly in 2010, 2011, then ACTA, which took place mainly in 2012, and then TTIP and CETA, which took place a little bit later, 2014, 2015, 2016, allows precisely to capture different moments in time in which this protest was successful or not. And one of the things that, and the important findings of the book is that the protest cycle also matters. So the fact that Spain had important anti-austerity protests in some ways made it more difficult for afterwards move all that protest in only 1 year later to fight ACTA. So the protest cycles really matters, even though it has to be as well in combination with the constellation of actors, and to what extent the network of actors that is built at a moment in time, in some cases it is reproduced later on. So the networks that activists build over time matter in order to understand future mobilization. And I think that very convincingly, Julia shows that very well. And how in some ways, structures are also constructed by actors. So the fact that there is an important mobilization against TTIP and CETA, as we have seen, it's probably going to eventually reproduce at some moment in the future when there's a new trade agreement or there's a new issue in which these actors that already know each other might be able to collaborate. And this takes place both at the national level and at the transnational level, because there are constellation of actors that are important in mobilizing people at the national level that understand how the political context in which they are operating on influences their capacity to be successful. But also we also need transnational actors that are able to bridge the social mobilization in different countries. And as Julia shows, this is different from case to case. So in the case of TTIP and CETA, we did have a few actors that were operating more at the European level and coordinating different national mobilizations, whereas in the case of austerity, the main actors involved were really those based at the national level. But yeah, if you're interested, we can also talk more about the concrete cases. And finally, to as well open the debate, I really enjoyed reading the book. I think it's a great contribution. And there's, however, one thing that I didn't find entirely convincing, and it's a relatively small, it's a small. It's a small thing, but that I think it remains relevant, and I think it will touch upon as well on the question that you discussed about the connection between agonistic and antagonistic politicization. And in page 156, you cite that instead of completely ignoring the argument for national sovereignty as nationalists, Green left activists have the chance to reconceptualize national sovereignty as primarily a question of democratic participation and to promote popular and parliamentary sovereignty. So while I fully agree at the level, at the conceptual level, I have my doubts at the political level. So whether it can be a winning frame for transnational social movements. So if we are looking at to what extent we can see more transnational social movements whether ideas or concepts such as sovereignty might be harmful to build, for instance, coalitions between Eastern and Western NGOs and trade unions. And I think this is also an empirical question, and whether this is really the case. At least in the case of TTIP and CETA, I think it was interesting precisely the absence of this concept among the left-wing or the green left activists. So that's it for me. And yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very, very much, Alvaro. When I think about debates in European studies 10, 15 years ago, you know, legitimacy really was the buzzword. And now I see how, you know, sovereignty, and of course, having currently a project on conflicts of sovereignty, I wouldn't say anything different, but I think the question you pose, Alvaro, is really interesting. And sovereignty definitely has become, you know, a new concept which crystallizes many reflections coming from different subfields, different angles to think about European integration today. But we want now hear the comments and the critiques, hopefully, from Niels Gheyle. Niels, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from my part as well. People often start off saying that they're pleased to be here or that they are honored to have been invited, and they do that regardless of whether that is true or not. But in this case, I am actually genuinely pleased to be here and very honored to have been invited to discuss these two excellent books by two very gifted scholars as well. I've had the pleasure to meet both of them and to read their stuff before, and I can honestly say that what they have produced here is very much in line with all the interesting stuff that they have done before. So I'm very excited to be a discussant of their work here. I've been asked to discuss a little bit the similarities and the differences, overlaps and where they don't overlap between them, which I will show on a slide that I have prepared. It's only one slide, hopefully no technical problems involved here. Do you already see this?
Yes, we do.
Voila.
But you can go with the slideshow. Here we go.
Now we have slideshow, but apparently I cannot see any of your faces anymore again. So just intervene when there is something wrong. I should stop or something else.
We're happy, don't worry.
Yeah, okay. Similarities and differences, and I've already put a question mark next to differences because I found many more similarities actually than differences. It's not only because of the obvious thematic overlap there, but I think that any differences that I spotted were very much geared towards complementary ideas about the stuff they're talking about. And as you have probably also noticed in Alvaro's and Julia's discussion of each other's book, they also hint upon things like, this was similar in my work, this is something that I saw it as well. Some of these things will come back. I hope that is not too much of a repetition. So I have 6 similarities and 3 differences that I will gloss over in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So first of all, I think what they didn't talk about is the origin of all the contestation and the protests. Both of them, they actually start from the same idea, the same theoretical idea even, which is fighting neoliberal hegemony. And I'm deliberately not talking about neoliberal policies here, but because obviously much of the protest and the contestation was about the policies themselves, the austerity policies, the way that ACTA or TTIP as trade agreements would have an impact on social or on environmental provisions. But it was more underlying here, a fight against a solidification of neoliberal hegemony. And I say that because this is a deeper concern, which they argue is a situation whereby these neoliberal policy options would be made ever more hard to contest, void of any contestation, the default option, the pensée unique. And I think that that was unique about these austerity and free trade agreements that were being proposed, and that they were not just policies in and of themselves that can be discussed on their merits or not, but also because of the way that they were being proposed and the implications in terms of the new institutions, structure and rules that we put in place would all make sure that different alternative projects, different alternative futures would ever be made more difficult to contest in the public sphere. They talk about these two anti-democratic tendencies that were present in these, and not only the way that they were being negotiated behind closed doors, but also their envisionment indeed of structures, of fixed rules that make this neoliberal policy options in terms of open free trade, in terms of austerity, the default option. And I think that much of the outrage and the contestation that they saw was very much related to this underlying concern, which is very much in line with other thinkers like Quinn Slobodian, Stephen Gheyle, who talk about the constitutionalization of economic policy, those kinds of issues that they, I think, are very much they are departing or not departing, they're starting from that assumption or that point of view. So that's something that they didn't talk about, but which I think that is already a large similarity in the beginning of their analysis. Secondly, when we talk about the dynamics, this is something that Alvaro has already taken up, and I want to re-stress it here because I think indeed it might perhaps be the biggest added value of the works combined, is that they move us away from seeing differences in protest, differences in contestation or in politicization, no longer explaining these only from structural variables. It's not to say that this is only happening in the politicization literature or social movement literature from structural variables, but still there's this focus on differences in media openness or differences in the levels of economic insecurity as being the main variables that might explain differences there. They move us towards agency, and they argue that it's agents that matter. It's the presence of players that matters. It's the presence of already existing networks, of expertise, of frames that have traveled from another area in time or in space that actually matter, whether there will be diffusion, whether there will be a transnational debate actually unfolding, rather than looking at these very rigid independent variables as structures. I think that is something that we should dig deeper in. And some of my later comments here are related to that. Now, the first of them is timing and attention as an important consideration when we think about agency. If we indeed make that move towards seeing agents and agents, especially as the explanatory factor, but just the crucial factor in seeing how protest and contestation and debate diffuses, this is something that both of them either explicitly or implicitly focus on, is the relevance of timing and attention. I think that Julia mentions this issue of timing. Why did certain protests not diffuse to, I think it was Italy in the case of anti-austerity protests? Well, she argues simply because they were in a quite different protest phase at the moment. That the timing was just off. Structurally speaking, it might be ideal to have protests. There might even be players ready there, but it was simply bad timing. And I think that this is something, if we see this together with Alvaro's contribution, we might even expand to the notion of attention as a limited resource. And that is something I think that should be much more central in explanations of diffusion and contestation and conflict diffusion, is that attention is a limited resource. There can be structural variables ready to be exploited. There can be players ready to be exploited, but they cannot focus on everything at the same time. If they are already embroiled in a very large conflict movement, focusing on austerity, for example, and then there is this other thing that they would like to focus on, which is TTIP or ACTA, you cannot really expect that. Obviously, this is then going to happen. I mean, you can only focus on so many things at the same time. Even the public as such can also only incur so many things at the same time. And I think that this attention variable is something that we have to put central. And I think that they, either explicitly and implicitly, very much do so. Argue that it's not so obvious that, that we see all these things at the same time happening. An aspect related to this again is my fourth of 6 similarities is coordination and organization. Perhaps to the crowd that we're talking here, social movement scholars, trade politicization scholars, it might not come as a surprise that much diffusion or transnational debate, if it happens, if it is successful, depends to a large extent on coordination and organization. Here, that might not be as surprising. But still, in the public debate, that argument that protests, successful protests, diffusion that is successful, transnational debate that is successful, that is essential, is actually used in a very different way. I remember from the TTIP debate, for example, that the very fact that it was being coordinated and organized was being used by supporters of TTIP in saying that the whole controversy over TTIP was manipulated, was simply, this is not spontaneous grassroots or citizen protest, this is organized by some groups. And so I think, and I hope perhaps, that their books here, by putting central in their explanations of successful transnational debate and diffusion, that it leads to some kind of normalization that coordination and organization are key, and that is always somehow an element of politics even, or of successful contestation and protest. So that it's no longer being used as a stick to beat protesters or activists with, but rather seen as an essential part of how these things actually work. A fifth point, what they show is that much of this conflict and protest diffusion is very much dependent also on a domestication of conflict. Alvaro again hinted upon this by looking at, we look at where the politics happens in the national polities, in the national public spheres. But what we see here, and both of them have very nice examples of this, is that these transnational frames, these transnational big ideas of what is wrong with austerity or with trade agreements is always translated to a domestic context, to things that people actually know. I think perhaps the most striking example, the best example of this, is in Alvaro's book when he talks about that very perhaps abstract master frame, corporations versus democracy, that was something that many groups could unite around. But the moment this enters, or how this enters the British public sphere, was in the frame TTIP is going to attack or is going to dismantle the NHS. And so underlying is still that same idea of corporations that will push for privatization and hence erode democracy in some way, but it has to be translated to things that people can relate to. And I think both of them very nicely show that all of these protests, if they diffuse, there is an active adopter or an active translation necessary. And then finally, it's beyond the constraining the senses. I mean, probably you now think of Alvaro's work mostly because he is specifically going beyond that constraining the senses with the notion of empowering the senses. And I think both of them actually show or are a very good counterweight to much of the literature that is now erupting in politicization studies, that all focus on this indeed constraining the senses, because they see the main cleavage nowadays between pro-integration or integrationists and demarcationists, between cosmopolitans and communitarians, between pro-EU or anti-EU. And if all of it would indeed be in this type of cleavage, then constraining the senses could very well be what we have at our hands here. And it may be that this is indeed the dominant cleavage nowadays in Europe, but I think what Alvaro and Julia's book very nicely show is that it doesn't have to be, is that much of the contestation that is still lingering can certainly be on left-right grounds, or even another cleavage, but not the pro-anti-EU cleavage that is now so very dominant, or made so very dominant by populist radical right parties. And so they show that there are lots of policies that we can contest in things that we know, like a left-right cleavage, and that this might indeed, as Alvaro shows, theoretically or even philosophically, might lead us going beyond such a constraining the senses, and might actually be beneficial for the legitimacy of the EU. So you could say that in a sense, both are trying to recapture or reinterpret Euroscepticism in such a way that it's not only the sort of hard Euroscepticism that everyone knows of being anti-European Union, but that there's much more and many more different forms of Euroscepticism that are legitimate, and in the sense that they legitimize the EU as a playing field. So I think that only for these similarities, they deserve broad attention, both of their works. And so some differences that I wanted to point out, that nonetheless are perhaps very much overlapping as well. One difference is that they have a little bit of a different notion of, or have a different implementation of that notion of differentiated politicization. And with this, I mean that contestation, protest, politicization, it is thought of always that this will necessarily vary across countries. And I think that Julia, her work very nicely shows this. She's interested in degrees of conflict, in intensity of conflict, in when protests are becoming very large or when they stay rather under the radar. And so in that respect, I think that Julia is most closely aligned with that idea of differentiated politicization. Alvaro, on the other hand, it would seem as if his result is very much surprising, he calls himself, because he finds similarities over these very different countries, Spain, France, and the UK. His results, his empirical results, empirical chapters are very similar to each other. But indeed, the main reason, and I think that Alvaro himself hinted upon this before, is that they focus on different aspects of politicization. Julia focuses on degrees of conflict, intensity of conflict, and how this differs. Alvaro focuses on the content and the type of conflict. And indeed, I think if Julia would focus on the type of conflict, she would perhaps also find very much similarities, that the same kind of frames are being diffused over countries, over regions, and so not too much difference there. And so that's a difference because they highlight different aspects of what you could see as the essence of politicization, but in a sense, they are very much complementary in that there are also analyses that start focusing now not only on degrees of conflict as the essence of politicization, but also on the content of conflict. What exactly is being said? How much choice expansion is being used here? Are there any counter-hegemonic projects being proposed, or is it simply meddling in the margin? So in that case, I think there are overlapping as well. My penultimate point is something about their point of view on the media. I think at some points, some more explicit than others, they both see the mass media as somehow an end stage, a very crucial step in protest diffusion, in contestation, because obviously it has the largest reach in terms of visibility and the audiences that it can reach. And I think that Alvaro approaches his work from a rather top-down perspective, immediately focusing on the mass media, and also in his interviews focusing on journalists, on the gatekeepers of mass media. So when does conflict actually enter the mediated public sphere? How does it enter this mediated public sphere? So a kind of top-down perspective, putting mass media at the central from the very beginning. I think that Julia takes a more bottom-up approach, focusing on the many different players that all fight for attention, all have their own media channels, sometimes very close to mass media, others very far off that, but still arguing that these battles that take place under the radar also make a lot of sense in the end explaining why mass media matters and how they reach that mass mediated level. It's not simply that journalists at some point miraculously start focusing on it. They pick up on many of the dynamics that she describes in terms of players having all their own media arenas and media channels to focus on. So they've at some point converge on the point of mass media as being the most important arena to have your conflicts and have your concerns reflected in, but somehow have come from a top-down and a bottom-up perspective. Last point then is that both have normative considerations, but also in kind of a different respect. I think a bit related to this point about differentiated politicization, Julia is very much focused on political strategy, on giving recommendations and tips to protesters and activists of how they can do better, of what they have to avoid, of what they should do better. So from a normative point of view, we need protest, we need to know how protest diffuses, and so she wants to give some considerations towards those main actors who are actually involved in doing all of this. I think that Alvaro also has normative considerations, but again, more focused on the content. He very much thinks that from a democratic point of view, what we need is counter-hegemonic projects. It is different genuinely different alternative futures being made visible in the public sphere. And that is his normative wish to some extent. But again, there is still some overlap here, because in a secondary step, they focus on each other then again. I think that Julia is again focusing on alternative trade mandates and really focused on the content of what should be actually made the content or the prime focus of these protest actors. While Alvaro is in the second step also, of course, concerned with coalition formation and with framing and with protest dynamics and how actually a transnational debate can erupt. And I think that that is, again, evidence of how close they are together. So I hope that this made sense to some extent, and that, wait, am I still sharing here? Yes, I'm still sharing. Let me stop sharing here. Okay, now I can see people again, which is really weird to have been talking to a black screen for the last 10 minutes. So I hope that this made sense a little bit, and that this gives an overview of the combined added value that both books prove to have. I had a question for both of them, but my question towards Alvaro has been stolen by Julia already. I'm also concerned by but the question between qualitative newspapers and tabloids, because indeed Hans-Jörg Trenz, for example, has shown that the differences between quality newspapers might be much less than differences within one country between a quality and a tabloid newspaper. So if that indeed would be true to some extent, what does indeed the choice for quality newspapers mean for your results? And a comment or a question I had to Julia was that move away from political opportunity structures and the focus on agency. I've said it, it's one of the biggest contributions that you both have, but you explicitly. It obviously brings us as well into the discussion, that age-old discussion between structure and agency, and what matters to explain these things. And by moving towards agency as a counterweight, I'm still troubled with where is the structural element then? Is that something that you think is completely absent, that we do not have to focus on anymore? Or is structure somehow transformed or implied in what you now describe with the focus on these actors? As a final example, you talk about Bulgaria, for example, and that they have experience with austerity, and that many of them are pro-transatlantic or some of these things. These are sometimes seen as structural elements that might make it more difficult to find resonance of what you're saying. Does that then no longer play a role? And if it does, how does it play a role then still, beyond looking just at the actors who are present and who can actually mobilize a protest? I hope I haven't been talking for too long. I will remain silent for the remainder of this session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Niels, for this very, very in-depth and stimulating discussion. So a lot of questions and comments have been raised already. So I do want to give you a chance to respond, but could you please keep it quite brief, to a couple of minutes perhaps, so we have time for more questions. So in reverse order, do you want to start, Alvaro?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, no, thanks so much, Niels, for really this fantastic overview and of the differences and and the similarities, because I agree very much that basically we agree, and there's a very common perspective. To reply to the two questions that Julia posed, and which was basically similar to Niels. There's an empirical question why they didn't choose tabloids, which is the lack of a functionally equivalent ones in the other countries. So that made it more difficult. So if I choose the UK, I don't really find an equivalent to the Daily Mirror in France or in Spain. So that is a clear empirical barrier. And more broadly, there's also an element of the tabloids not necessarily playing the same role in the public sphere as the qualitative newspapers. So the way in which the perspective from which I departed is that in some ways the qualitative media that I chose, especially in the UK, like The Guardian, the BBC, or the Financial Times, are in some ways more authoritative at the level of producing or introducing issues in the political debate. So that's a little bit the reason, but I also see the counterpoint, and that is that is a caveat that was, however, very difficult to address empirically. So there's as well a pragmatic choice as well as a normative one. And then just to come back to this agonistic and antagonistic, and I think this is a very interesting point, and I think this relates very much to your book, Julia, and all the discussion that you have about the co-optation of the far right of some of these protests, right? And I mean, in practice, I think that we can have both agonistic and antagonistic debates at the same time, and I think this is perhaps best illustrated with the case of TTIP and Brexit. It's not necessarily the case that they can be complementary, that on the one hand you can have a very antagonistic debate on Brexit, like I would argue is the one that took place, with at the same time a very agonistic debate about TTIP. And the explanation I would probably give for this sort of thing is that basically the far right cares quite little about EU policies, right? So they will probably try to indeed use TTIP or use austerity in order to reframe the debate or redirect the debate towards sovereignty and EU versus the nation state and so on. So I think this is an interesting point that I think definitely deserves more empirical attention. But yeah, I would argue they don't necessarily have to operate completely separately. They can be complementary. They can operate at the same time. And in terms of the impact that might have on the future of European integration, that's also an empirical question I don't really have a good answer for. But my sense is that the more agonistic we have, the less antagonistic we will have. So in some ways, I think that if the debate increasingly focuses on the agonistic, the far right and the, let's say, sovereignty argument loses track against it. So that's what I would say. Yeah. But thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Alvaro. Well, this was basically the point made quite some time ago by Peter Mayer. He said that if you have, more opposition on policies, you'll have less anti-system opposition. But then you could argue, as I did, that you also have a spillover from one to the other. So it remains an open empirical question, indeed. Okay, Julia.
Yes, so the question about sovereignty. I guess I would start with basically arguing that it really depends on how we define sovereignty. And here I'm very much influenced by our project on conflicts of sovereignty. So I think Alvaro, throughout the book, defines sovereignty as national sovereignty. So basically the UKIP style, AfD, etc. The way I see sovereignty is more from a democratic perspective. And so I see it following everything that actually Amandine and Natalie and Ramon and Chris have written. It's also a matter. So I don't say that there is not national sovereignty conflicts. It's kind of vertical conflicts between the state and the EU. But I do see also very much a conflict between people and parliament and the executives. And I think that at an empirical level, we already see this, right? So we saw this very much, I think also in TTIP and CETA, with nations insisting, or politicians insisting they should be ratified also at the national level and not just left to the EU. From a democratic perspective, not necessarily always from a national sovereignty perspective, right? But we saw it also very clearly in the Greek case, so the case of the Greek referendum, where we had a whole, basically, we had a people democratically deciding against accepting the conditions of the Troika and then still having to accept them, right? I start my book with basically, I think, the Greek example. I was there and I was very shocked. So it depends how we define sovereignty. That's my first answer. Then normatively, should we use sovereignty? There are a lot of authors that now argue the left should embrace sovereignty more. It has started doing it. There was a very interesting article by Laura Chazelle, a PhD at Grenoble, who writes on basically how Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, for example, has started talking about sovereignty. Paulo Gervado, his new book, as we discussed with Alvaro at the point before, his new book is basically making the argument that the left should embrace sovereignty. So empirically, it's happening. Normatively, more and more left-wing thinkers are going there. Practically speaking, and I think this is the core of Alvaro's question, will this work? I don't know. I think rhetorically very different, like very with a lot of difficulty. I think it's a very fraught with risk project because the danger of slipping to nationalism is huge, especially if we talk about the cooperation between trade unions from Eastern Europe and Western Europe, which is one of the examples I'm giving. It's very difficult to find a common ground based on democratic sovereignty when we have such clear conflicts based on basically national interests. Of course, the reason why we have such types of conflicts is also the economic governance structure of the EU that basically pits one nation against the other in terms of who will export more, etc., right? So rhetorically, I think it would be difficult. But the reason why I still hold on to this notion of democratic sovereignty, apart from liking our project and being very much under the influence of everyone, is I think also at the institutional level. This is a type of rhetoric that makes sense. I think democratic sovereignty at the national level is still the best way we can achieve things. And yeah, I think Spain is the best case. And then having this and forming transnational coalitions seems to me more efficient practically to achieve changes rather than hoping that the European Commission will suddenly start listening more to the European Parliament, etc. So just purely practically, I think it's difficult on a rhetorical level. At the institutional level, it might be actually the only chance we have, unless there is more politicization at the EU level, more cooperation, etc. The NGOs we see in Brussels are not democratic enough for me. They are great and they do amazing work, but they are not representative in the same way a national parliament is. And unfortunately, the EP is still not as representative, even though it might be. And I really like your conclusion, Alvaro, that we need more left-right opposition, right? When it comes to the question of Niels about structure and agency, thank you, Niels. This was like the most complicated question you could possibly think of. To be honest, I don't care much about these very theoretical debates in the sense of I have read them, but I'm not emotionally engaged in them. The reason why I focused on agency is ultimately because it allowed me to explain why, for example, in countries such as Bulgaria and Romania that had horrible austerity measures, there was no protest whatsoever. Because, I mean, usually the argument that people give back to me is, but yeah, maybe you had a difference in protest just because these were like, some countries had austerity and some didn't. And in my book, I show that countries that did have it actually did have protest. Now, structure is a very complicated term. I agree. So, at the individual level, in both Romania and Bulgaria, you have a lot of people who are more, let's say, liberal right rather than socialist. Is this structure, is it the result of historical legacies? I don't know. I mean, it's also an individual trait. We have also networks that are formed between people. I would say for me, what was interesting was how structures change. I don't mind the concept of structure. I do believe that some people are completely precluded from participating in social mobilization or the politicization of the youth, just as a function of their class, lack of resources, etc. In this case, I find structure as very useful as an explanatory tool, right? But once we have the actors who actually mobilize, I find it more interesting to see how they connect to each other, how they travel, how ideas travel. So I would not say I'm against the notion of structure. I think in a very good classic Marxist sense, it's great. It's just that when I try to explain mobilization, it is too static to show what is happening. And it is too static to allow change and to allow for change. So showing how some, for example, intellectuals, Bulgarian intellectuals who studied in Western European universities came back, started rediscovering socialist traditions and started creating mobilizations and protests, I'm better able to capture these dynamics. Are these intellectuals privileged kids from the center of Sofia? Yes. I was going to say, am I one? Probably yes. But this still helps us explain how this change is happening. So I'm practical. I think I use the concepts just to explain things. I might be more hardcore and like emotionally invested in them, and maybe I'll become at some point, but not in this book.
Okay, good. It is high time to open the discussion for questions from further participants. Any questions coming from the audience? Don't be shy. You may turn your camera on and be with us. Okay, so until people make up their mind, perhaps I throw my own questions and comments. Obviously, there are many, given my also special interest in the topic. One question for Alvaro is the following. You argue in your book that mobilization against TTIP has had policy effects. You write that a few times. And I am slightly skeptical of that. And the thing is, we might not really know, because at the end of the day, the negotiations over TTIP were interrupted by Donald Trump, not by the European Union. And I think this is really important. And of course, we can't, work with counterfactuals. What would have happened if it wasn't Trump, but another president, and the negotiations would have gone on? How would have the European Commission dealt with that contestation? We don't really know, and we can't know. But when you say that, when you argue this, what I think you're talking about is more about deeper paradigmatic change. So you say, okay, contentious actors have been successful in making their own ideas mainstream, in questioning the rationale behind free trade, and so forth and so on. And I concur with that. But these are not policy effects. Policy effects is something different. Is about really the responsiveness of decision makers, of those people who decide within the EU institutions, mainly in that case. And in our research about CETA, which is interesting because although the campaign was mainly joined with TTIP, the crucial difference, of course, is that CETA went on and was eventually concluded. And in our joint paper with Julia that we're working on at the moment, we have looked at further agreements concluded after CETA, and we are trying to see whether really CETA was a game changer, in terms of how the trade policy of the EU is made. And we conclude that mainly it has not been a game changer, and that we have this return to quiet politics. And what we also find is that the EU institutions, mainly the European Commission, building on the court, have implemented a successful strategy to contain contestation. So they have broken down basically free trade agreements into two, and saying, okay, only investment issues, including dispute settlement between investors and states, will require the agreement of regional and national parliaments. But everything else, where people also had their critiques related to regulations, all this is classical trade stuff, and that's still in the scope of the EU's exclusive competence. And so here, of course, the European Parliament comes in the spotlight, because all the, let's say, the democratic and parliamentary dimension will rely on the EP only. And what do we see with CETA? Well, the EP approved CETA. So, I mean, I am in my 2016 book about welfare marketization and the contestation of liberalization policies, I was really interested in that responsiveness dimension, because from a democratic point of view, we can say everything we want and be as optimistic as we want about, mobilization happening. But what is the impact on decision makers? That's perhaps even more important. And there, what we see is that, this attention that Niels was talking about, this attention is not really sustained. So we see politicization and contestation popping up, on certain issues. We have that over the GATS, we had it over ACTA, and so on, but it's not sustained. And in the background, those policies are continuing, and we have more trade agreements. And so I am not sure whether the answer to the question, has mobilization really changed fundamentally something to the EU trade policy is yes. So that's my drawback. A question to both of you, and it's been already partly raised by by Niels also. It's about the media and the role of the media. And I have a question about the role of digital media in particular. Because I think that here also you may have a slightly different stance on what the role of digital communication. But really, it's an open question. So, do we see a success or a failure of democratization through the internet? I mean, it's a very perhaps too simplistic of a question, but after all, you know, there was this hope. On the one hand, we see movements and alternative movements, small groups of citizens being able to use the digital media to build up networks from the bottom up. So you both show that. But Julia argues that the traditional mainstream media is still key, that in some cases, if you do not have attention from the traditional public sphere, offline public sphere, then, you know, hopes for, you know, further attention only from those smaller digital tools or smaller audiences is actually hopeless. So do you see, you know, and you, Alvaro, you say that actually the emergence of an alternative digital public sphere has been mainly disruptive for established patterns of mobilization, established patterns of communication. So what should we think of it? I mean, I'm really not, I mean, this is not something that I engaged with in my own research. And for the rest of us who do not research on digital media, but being aware that this is really playing a very important role, what would be your message? How should we think of it? Is it, you know, just a mere reflection of the traditional public sphere, or a new tool that democratizes, or actually a new tool that disrupts the democratic functioning of societies? And I guess that, you know, Niels could address those questions as well, starting from his own expertise on the politicization of trade. So I don't know who from you would like to react. Or
I can kickstart with a policy question and touch upon the other one. So yeah, thanks so much, Amandine, for the great comments and questions. So I think the fact that TTIP didn't happen is already a result of the mobilization. So that the first policy effect is the lack of a TTIP, because even if it's true that Trump, the election of Trump, in some ways facilitated to put TTIP on the freezer, I think anyways TTIP was already kind of dead. So basically Trump gave a good excuse for the European Commission to end TTIP without saying, well, actually, you know, we couldn't save it anyway. But additionally, I think the policy effects obviously are not at the level of the policy paradigm, to use the Peter Hall terminology. But I do think that there are important policy effects at the level of transparency. And I think Niels has written a great paper about it, about how the politicization changed the transparency of the negotiations. And I think there's generally been a different approach. I think that especially the Malmström period as EU Trade Commissioner made a genuine effort to change at least some things. And indicative of that is the fact that in 2015, so already with the mobilization in full swing, the European Commission published a new EU trade strategy called Trade for All, that replaced the previous one by Karel de Gucht and the previous one of Peter Mandelson of the Global Europe, in which it was a very neoliberal way of understanding trade. And for, you know, maybe we can be cynical and say, well, you know, actually they just adopted some static changes. And I think that's partially true. But at the same time, I do think that people in the Commission working on trade made a few small changes at the level of transparency, at the level of including certain NGOs and trade unions more closely into the negotiations. So it didn't necessarily radically change how EU trade policy functions and the content of those negotiations. I would agree with that. Yet at the same time, there are some changes that I think nonetheless remain important to point out nonetheless. And then about the second question, I think the emergence of digital media offers opportunities to activists. And I think that's definitely something that we have seen in the case of TTIP and CETA, that the use of these alternative digital spaces has facilitated both the connections between activists as well as the traveling of certain ideas from those spaces to the mainstream. So the mainstream spaces remain, I think, crucial, yet the capacity to raise some issues and make them trending topic and so on, that plays a role in mainstream media actors to adopt some of these ideas. But yeah, I realize I'm maybe too long, so I'll just leave it. Thanks.
Yeah, so I will address the second question about digital media, basically. And here I think there is a very useful distinction by Pietro Castelli-Gattinara and Samuel Boron, who write on the far right. But the distinction they make is very interesting, and it's between internal media practices and external oriented practices. And so when we talk about the internal ones, we speak about coordination, organization, identity building. And there I think digital media did appear with a lot of promise for like democratization. So we had the anti-austerity and actually like the anti-austerity, anti-corruption and pro-democracy protests in Spain, the Indignados protests. They were experimenting a lot with open source software. They were very radically democratic and horizontal. I mean, I'm really impressed by what happened in Spain. But this drive towards like participation of everyone using non-proprietary tools, etc., this has died out. And actually what we saw in the subsequent years and subsequent protests was the fact that almost everyone went to Facebook and Twitter, etc. And there we can't speak of proper democratization. Even looking at the campaigns against TTIP and CETA, we had a lot of centralization of tools and platforms in the hands of a few NGOs. Like my favorite example is citizens writing letters to MPs, but actually the letter was previously written and you just had to click on it. Is this democratization? I'm not 100% certain. I think digital media still have the potential to democratize this internal aspect, but it really depends on basically who owns this media, what are the codes of use of this media, etc. With Facebook and Twitter, I don't think we'll see this. Then when it comes to the communicative aspect of digital media and how they were basically used to attract the attention of mainstream media, etc. Again, I would say there was a lot of promise of democratization, of having more inclusive public spheres. Actually, a lot of public sphere theory in the beginning of the 2010s was talking about counter publics, and we're going to empower voices that haven't been heard. And again, we ended the decade with total marginalization of alternative voices. Like if we think also even of classical outer globalization media, such as indie media, it's not particularly popular anymore. So again, when it comes to this, I think mainstream media still matter a lot. But what we have seen is the rise of new intermediaries. So we don't have, I think, the people speaking directly their voice, disrupting the public sphere and public, like complete inclusion, democratic inclusion. But we have seen new media appearing. We have seen alternative media, unfortunately, more and more on the far right, such as Breitbart, for example. Yeah, we have seen a lot of journalists, for example, and Twitter pundits attracting huge followings and influencing the discourse. And in this sense, they have disrupted the public sphere completely. I don't think they have democratized it. And when it comes to popular mobilizations from below, I think there is a lot to be done. There I'm actually optimistic, but we need to reform basically the very platforms of communication we are using. And here,
okay. Okay, thank you, Julian. Niels, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to pitch in on something you mentioned and Alvaro mentioned earlier about responsiveness and policy change, what actually happened. And I think that both of your explanation might not be too far off. What you are saying, Amandine, is actually when we look at what is now in trade agreements and the way they are being negotiated, not so much has changed. And what Alvaro argues is still in TTIP, beyond the question of whether TTIP happened or not, we still saw some changes. And that is indeed true. ISDS has been reformed a little bit, and the transparency regime has been reformed a little bit. But this little bit is exactly what I think is interesting here, because we had a debate, a very open debate, based on we have to rethink the whole trade regime. This is not working anymore. This is a very broad frame of corporations against democracy. And the way that they have been responsive is actually the way they, as then the European Commission and decision makers, is by arguing, look, we have listened to the debate, we hear you, we know that something is wrong apparently. But the way they interpret this is modifying a little bit here, modifying a little bit there, and then arguing that they've done their job. They've listened. They are a responsive technocrat, a responsive bureaucrat. We listen to citizens. And so this also makes it much more difficult to contest now on the grounds that you are not transparent. Now they can build on a transparency regime shift in their eyes that says, look, we have actually listened to the debate. Things have changed. We are responsive to all of this. And I think that this dynamic is what is also interesting, is that you come from a very open debate about what is on the table, which is completely different futures for EU trade policy, that is being taken up actually by decision makers and then being molded into, we're going to change a little bit of this and a little bit of that, which can be read as nothing actually changes, or can be read as there are some policy changes here. But still, the dynamic in itself is also interesting to see how we look at responsiveness from the point of, are they responsive? Do they react? And that in itself is not enough. It's not just a reaction or a response that matters. It's the content of that response and how far they go in their modifications, aligning themselves with the public debates, or just interpreting it for their own benefit or something like that.
Yeah, there's actually a fantastic example that maybe we can put, which is the Conference on the Future of Europe, which has been decided and has been organized in a very traditionally EU technocratic way, right? Like all the institutions are playing a role and national parliaments are basically excluded only as observant and so on. Yet at the same time, the European Commission has hired Decidim, the Catalan platform that the mayor of Barcelona uses for the consultation. So they are using this, open software to include citizens in the discussion and so on, which in some ways we could see it as something good, but at the same time, the very foundation, the very structure of the conference precisely goes against that, right? So it's, in some ways, I think the Commission constantly attempts to adopt certain elements that are less difficult or less politically complicated to adopt, right? Like writing a general strategy called Trade for All that doesn't mean anything concretely, yet it shows that they want to change, or that they have shown that they have listened to people that are protesting, right? So there's this responsiveness, yet at the same time, the core remains unchanged. So in some ways, there's this very famous novel, Il Gatto Pardo, that says something has to change so that everything remains unchanged. So I think that's generally the position that the Commission takes.
Yeah, I would actually jump in with the idea of window dressing. So I mean, the European Commission has also had these public consultations, and it's very interesting when you read research on like what happens after the consultation. And it's not very encouraging, not to mention the ECI, where we have again an attempt for democracy from below, and it's again been very much, as like a colleague of mine, Manuel Weisgerber, shows, very much a window dressing. So this is why I think we need to talk about the levels and like the institutional settings where we can achieve meaningful change. I'm actually open to being convinced that the EU institutions are such a level, but it's just we haven't seen a lot of examples there yet.
The thing is that institutions are, there are different battles within the institutions themselves, right? So I think that in any case, any change will entail certain insiders to side with those that are asking for change. And I do think that, yeah, I agree with you, Julia. Yeah, yet at the same time, maybe it's just my optimistic perspective, but I do think that something, at least there are some people that want to change some things, but it is complicated, and this is a big machinery.
Okay, well, I see we have a group of very passionate people. We could go on, and myself concurring with you and talking about, window dressing and social policy and so on. For one last chance, we're a bit over time still. I give the opportunity if there's one comment or one question for somebody else which should be raised. And if not, I will end this seminar. Thank you so much for everybody, and of course, primarily to Julia and Alvaro for this great mutual presentation, and to Niels for being our great discussant today. Farewell to the books. We'll keep on advertising them. And I think that really for everyone who is interested in European politics in general, ranging from digital media to not only contestation and social movements, but to politicization much more broadly, those books are excellent reads. So I leave it there, and I wish you all a very nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks.